Hi everyone, Talia from Zart Art, and today I'm going to show you 3 different ways to make tissue paper flowers. So for materials, what I have here is just some standard tissue paper. So we've got some different cool colours that we'll be using. We've also got some very sturdy, thick wire. So as you can see, as I'm bending it, it's somewhat pliable in my hands, but it's still holding its shape. So this will work well for when we stand our flowers up. We've also got Super Tack, which we'll be using for our adhesive, and we've also got stapler, scissors, and some magic clay, which will help us put everything together. So I'm going to do first is show you our first flower. So it's a pretty simple process. So if you want to grab some tissue paper, and most of these will start with an accordion fold. So what I'm going to do is just fold the first part of the tissue paper up one way, then turn the paper over and fold it the other way, and we're going to keep doing this until the paper is completely folded. Okay, so now we've folded our tissue paper, and depending on how many flowers you're making or how big they want to be, you can reduce the size. So this will create quite a few flowers, as we have quite a bit of tissue paper here. So I'm just going to cut that in half, and then what I'm going to do is fringe one end. So fringing is just a little snip down one end of the tissue paper, and we're just going to do that all along the whole side. So once you've fringed the end completely, you can just snip off any parts that are still connected together. So if you're doing this with students, it's easier to trim these ends off afterwards, because students will find that the paper comes apart and then they don't get an even cut. So if you just leave those joined together, then it's easier for them to work with when you're making those small cuts. And also cut the bottom of your paper, just so they're not all connected. So you can pull these apart as well, just to see if they are still attached, and if they are, just give it a little cut so all the fringes don't have to be even. It won't really impact the flower later on. So now, as you can see, we've got a few strips that we can work with. So what I'm going to do is grab the wire. So we're going to start by wrapping the tissue paper along the wire with a little bit of Super Tack to help adhere it. What you could also do is use double-sided tape, which also makes things quite a bit easier, especially if you're working with younger kids, so they don't get glue on everything, because tissue paper is quite delicate. You do want to be a bit gentle with it as you're applying the Super Tack. So I'm just going to start by applying it directly onto the wire first, and then as I go, add more and more Super Tack as I twist the tissue paper around. So as you're wrapping, you can slowly move the tissue paper down, especially for this first part, just so you're covering a larger area, and that's definitely going to help you show the shape of the flower. Just make sure you add a little bit of Super Tack right to the end, just so that doesn't come undone. So that's the start of our little flower. And then with our other strips, what we're going to do is start slightly lower down and just do layer upon layer, moving down the piece of wire. As you're working, you might find that you need some longer strips just to get the shape of the flower. So my first ones were quite short, which would be fine if you were doing many flowers at one time. But because we're just doing this one, what I'm going to do is cut some more strips, but do larger fringes so that we can get that shape of the flower happening. The larger fringes, you might find that they can get stuck underneath your folds a little bit more than the shorter ones. So just make sure you pull them and fan them out as you're going, just so they don't get stuck to the end of the wire. Now you can keep going as far down as you like, but that looks like it's large enough for me. So what I'll do is just start to fan out some of these pieces, just making sure that none of the glue has stuck to it to hold them together. So you can just fan out these edges a bit more, but otherwise that's our first very simple flower. So that's quite easy to do, and some basic paper skills that you can teach some students. So we'll just leave that one off to the side, get rid of some of our excess pieces. So these are really easy to do, so you can make multiples of them and just keep on going. But with these excess, I'll just leave them over there, and then we'll move on to our next flower and the next colour as well. So here we've got a nice navy blue. So with this one, what I'm going to do is cut pieces in half. So just roughly, it doesn't have to be too precise. Layer them on top of each other. You probably want to have between 6 and 10 pieces. So once these are all stacked together, what you can do is either trace a rough circle shape, or you can draw one yourself, but you do want to adhere the middle together. So what I'm going to do is just get that stapler in as far as I can to the middle, just making sure that all the pieces of paper are roughly in the same place. So you could get a few different flowers out of this. So just working around that staple, I'm going to cut a circle. So just a rough circle, doesn't have to be perfect, and just the size of what you would like your flower to be. So that looks like a fairly good size to me. And again, you can get multiple flowers out of the excess tissue paper. But just with this piece, what I'm going to do is scrunch up each layer. So starting with the first layer, very simple one, just scrunch that up to get the bud or the middle of the flower, and then the next layer, pull that up, scrunch that in, and then we'll build layers upon layers that will start to fan out. Now we've got our second flower, so that's again a really nice simple process that you could do even with your junior primary students. So you can leave that freestanding, or you could attach it to a base to stand it up. So what I'm going to do is use our very strong wire as well as some magic clay to just adhere that onto the bottom of our flower. So magic clay has an adhesive in it, so it will stick to paper very, very easily. And we'll just get a rough cylindrical shape, push that to the bottom of our flower, and then we can push the wire through. So just make sure that that is nice and attached. So we don't want the wire coming loose. So if you push the magic clay a bit further up the wire, that will make sure it's nice and stable. So as that dries, that will stick nice and easily onto there. If you find that it is flopping a little bit, if your staple wasn't right in the middle of the flower, you can just add a little bit more glue and that will keep it sturdy. But for now, we'll let the magic clay dry and sit those two together. So now moving on to our third flower. So we'll use a light blue for this one. And again, we'll be using an accordion fold. So just with one sheet of paper, making it a bit thicker than the first one this time. So now we've got our accordion fold, and I'm just going to fold that in half just to make cutting the first shape a bit easier. So what I'm going to do is cut some petal shapes, so just semicircles, or you could do some different shapes like triangles if you wanted to as well. But I'm just going to do a few semicircles going up and down. And again, you want to make sure that they won't be attached to each other as you're pulling them apart, so just give them a trim down one end so you can pull them apart down there as well. And I'm also going to do a deeper cut down here, making sure you don't go all the way to the end, just so later on we're able to fan out the petals. Just make sure that they're not all attached, and just cut any of the ones that are still joined together. So good thing about this is you don't need perfectly straight, even lines. So we've got a few here that we can get started with, and depending on how big you want the flower, you may or may not want to trim a few more. So just get rid of the scraps, and we'll just grab our wire, and very similar to the first one, just start by putting a little bit of glue on the tip. So these petals are a bit larger than the first set, so we're going to start a bit further down the wire and just wrapping that around to create the center of the flower. Make sure you get any excess glue off your fingers for this next part. So now I'm going to start on the next layer of the petal, so getting another strip of paper and just starting a little bit onto our first piece of tissue paper. Place that down and go through the same process of twisting this around again. So when you are wrapping your piece of tissue paper around, depending on when you're happy with it, how big you want the flower, you might want to do 6 or more layers. Usually you can use about 4 or 5 before you start to get the flower shape. So I'm just going to keep wrapping and keep doing this until I'm happy with how the flower looks. once you've fixed up just the placement of the petals and you've ruffled them out a little bit, you can keep adding more layers depending on how large you want the flower to be. So I'm happy with that. So we've got our 3 different flowers in our cool tones. So they're all fairly easy to achieve. They're all just some very simple paper folding techniques. So they really look nice en masse if you wanted to display them as a class project in some vases, and they work really well together. So this is a really great project for junior or middle primary school children, especially if you're teaching them scissor skills. This can be quite a cheap project as well, only needing wires, tissue paper, scissors and glue to make the whole project complete. I hope you enjoyed the video and I look forward to seeing you next week.